Hello, friends. Today, by a personal request, I'm going to be reviewing one of the greatest books of the 20th century. And that is a book by the German historian and philologist Walter Bauer. And in English, his book is called Orthodoxy and Heresy. Originally published in the 1930s, this book was only published in English in 1971, and from that time it has revolutionized how we frame early Christian history. It is, in many ways, outdated, but to understand where we are now, it is important to understand how we got here. And so I've taken the time to give you the basic scholarly knowledge about this book in summary form. As I like to say, these book reviews are a service to you. They don't replace actually reading the book, because I can't delve into the kind of detail that Bauer does. So go pick up this book if it further interests you. And since I'll only be giving basic information, I will also be offering suggestions for further reading, which can guide you on where to go next for more updated research. But for now, let's begin. Arguably, the first church history is the Book of Acts, which scholars typically date anytime between about 80 and 150. I tend to view this as a 2nd century work and even a mid-2nd century work, and so I encourage everyone to check out my video on dating Luke Acts. But as church history developed, the real titan of church history was Eusebius in the 4th century. And Eusebius is called the father of church history, just as Herodotus is the father of Greek history. Eusebius is the first ecclesial historian to really base his history on sources. And to a certain degree, he tells you what his sources were and what books he was reading in his library at Caesarea on the coast of Palestine. But as in all libraries, they are governed by the interests of those who keep them. And Eusebius's library was started by Origen, who came to Alexandria, actually in flight, because he was driven out by his own bishop. And Origen brought with him works of biblical exegesis, philosophy, and on some occasions of documents that don't survive anymore. And Eusebius, via his teacher Pamphilus, had access to this library. He added to it, greatly expanded it, and made sure that it was preserved. But it was spotty. And so when Eusebius went to write his history, he began with a framework of the people whom he supported as true Christians, so to speak, and other types of Christians whom Eusebius refused to call Christians and instead called heretics, literally those who choose And Eusebius therefore set the model of orthodoxy and heresy. It's not something that we really see in Luke Acts. And this model continued all the way to the 19th century. And according to this model, there was the true church, in which you investigate the sources of the true church, even if those people didn't recognize themselves as part of your movement. You recognize and highlight their writings, the ones that you agree with, and the writings that you don't agree with. You stigmatize as heretical and tell a story in which the so-called heretical writings really don't belong to Christianity, but are instead part of a demonically inspired deviation. Now, this model really lasts all the way until Bauer. And although Bauer isn't entirely unique, he is really the first to argue very convincingly and thoroughly that this model is highly tendentious and wrong. It itself is a form of Christian theology and identity construction. And what one needs to do is to look at all the sources equally and neutrally and in as disinterested a way as possible. And when one does that, one will see that so-called Orthodox or ecclesiastical Christianity wasn't the dominant form of Christianity in the 1st and 2nd centuries CE, and that later church historians who presented heretical groups as minority break-off movements were really trying to shore up their own identity in the 4th century, when one particular movement became the state church and state-funded. And so Christians engaged in a process of forgetting, and of deliberate forgetting, and of not mentioning or hereticalizing people whom they believe stood outside their tradition. This is what Bauer attempted to show. Bauer began his investigation with the city of Edessa, which is now in eastern Turkey. This was an early outpost, as it were, of Christians. And what Bauer was interested in was what kind of Christians were there. And he found primarily evidence of the followers of Marcion and Valentinus. And he discovered that the followers of Marcion had, as Orthodox writers like Ephraim later complained, Marcionites had more or less taken over the designation of Christian, and so to refer to Christian in that area was really to refer to a Marcionite Christian. And very late, at the turn of the 4th century, there came to be a competing community of so-called Orthodox believers, led by an industrious bishop, Cune. But still, the movement appears to be a minority even 50 years later, in the mid-4th century, with Ephraim, who is constantly doing battle with other groups of Christians, still the Marcionites, Valentinians, and also by his time the Manichaeans. And it's Ephraim who says that his group was called the Palutians, after a supposed bishop Palut. And Ephraim takes great umbrage, because he would of course want his own group to be called Christians, but he realizes that even in his time, which is well beyond Constantine, he does not have full authority to claim that name and have it make sense to all the other competing Christians. In the second chapter, Bauer then turned to Egypt, and he noted that Eusebius more or less ignored Egyptian history, Egyptian church history, in the late 1st and early 2nd century CE. And he didn't have any information, it seems. He could only report on certain people that he considered to be not part of his party or camp. Eusebius doesn't mention Apollos. He's not interested in what might be thought of as Jewish Christian groups in the late 1st century Egypt. He either doesn't know what was going on in Egypt at that time, or the sources that he had he chose not to use because they did not reinforce his own point of view. What Eusebius does report is that Mark, who is called a son of Peter in the letter of 1st Peter, was the first bishop of Alexandria, and Bauer considers this to be a Roman invention for clear reasons, because Peter had already been associated with Rome, and Rome wanted to take credit also for founding the church at Alexandria. So in a sense, they mythologically sent Mark, Peter's disciple, to Alexandria to form a Petrine group of Christians. Probably that's a Roman invention. All that Eusebius has for the late 1st and most of the 2nd century is simply a list of Orthodox bishops. And these are names which Bauer says are nothing more than a puff of smoke, because we have no idea who these people were. And Bauer suggests that this list was more or less derived in the early 3rd century under the first identifiably Orthodox bishop Demetrius, or possibly his successor Heraclius, via the work of Julius Africanus, who was a chronographer at that time. It is a pity that Bauer did not actually provide any thorough investigation of the movements surrounding Valentinus, Vassilides, and Carpocrates, but he does at least mention them as the only known Christian theologians at the time, all of them later hereticalized. And Apelles, who is a Marcionite, who by some accounts also visited Alexandria in the mid to late 2nd century. What Bauer proposes is that there were two movements in Alexandria, Egypt at the time, one primarily Gentile, using the distinctly Egyptian gospel of the Egyptians, and one Jewish employing what is called the gospel of the Hebrews. Both of these gospels Bauer considered to be Egyptian. Both now exist in fragments, and so Bauer used these fragments to construct communities. And this is how he found the information either not cited or ignored by Eusebius. Bauer then turned to Syria, and here his evidence was primarily the letters ascribed to Ignatius of Antioch. These letters are famously disputed in terms of both their authorship and date, but Bauer followed the traditional line of viewing them as early 2nd century letters from Syria. And through mere reading of these letters, he determined that Ignatius was not in any way mainstream, but was in fact a minority figure leading a minority group, overwhelmed, as it were, with so-called syncretistic Gnostic Christian movements and an even more dominant Jewish Christian community in the area. As Ignatius was arrested and moved through the cities of Asia Minor, he also noticed that these Asian cities were plagued, as it were, by what he considered to be Gnostic theologies and heretics who held high office. Many Christians who vigorously disagreed with Ignatius, and Ignatius was only able to find small pockets of Christians that sponsored him, and was in a sense writing against a sea of opposition, which indicates also his minority status and the minority and contested nature of his theology. Next came Asia Minor, which is modern Turkey. And here Bauer noticed that Eusebius was able to find some very minor supporters of his movement, namely Polycarp and Papias, but that when reading the letters, or the letter of Polycarp and the remains of Papias, Bauer noticed that they were not able to suppress larger and seemingly more dominant Christian movements, including, as we saw, followers of Marcion and Unitarian theologians who argued that God in Christ was one, and such as Noetus of Smyrna, and Montanism, which was a prophetic movement that believed in the very swift end of the world and the New Jerusalem coming down into Asia Minor. Bauer considered that Jude and the Johannine epistles, as well as the pastorals, represented some of the heated conflict that went on in Asia Minor, focused on Ephesus. And again, he found evidence that these writers were up against a wall, constantly fighting and doing rearguard, protective polemics against enemies, internal and external, and so-called break-off groups. And in the letters of 2nd John and 3rd John, it's very clear that very small communities are battling against other communities and are disfellowshipping their opponents. So this is a world of almost constant conflict, and this was why Bauer created this model of conflict, which showed that there were always different Christians and different Christian groups fighting for dominance and supremacy, with none fully able to conquer. And so we come to Rome. Now, Rome is very important for Bauer because Rome is the only place on the map of the Mediterranean where so-called Orthodoxy was able to establish itself and eventually to attain dominance. And it attained dominance by several maneuvers. As Bauer saw in the letter to First Clement, this was a letter sent from Rome by an anonymous author to Corinth, arguing that the Corinthians should reinstate the Christian leaders that they had driven out. And Rome was using its apparently unsolicited influence and theology to get back its political allies into power in Corinth. According to Bauer, certain upstarts whom he calls young Turks had taken over the leadership, and they represented a libertine Gentile majority. And so here we see Rome exerting its muscle. And this is very interesting because we don't see another church intervening in the affairs of churches miles away. This struck Bauer as very significant. Rome set the model for Orthodox Christianity by creating a myth of Orthodoxy via apostolic succession. The true message came only through a hierarchy of males, and I should say a series of males who succeeded each other. The first one being Peter, interestingly, Paul being ignored, although he was also in Rome and martyred in Rome. And then we have a series of names, which are, as in the case of Alexandria, just names, possibly fictional characters like Linus and Pius, people we don't know anything about other than their name. The formulation of apostolic lists, or lists joining apostles and church leaders, took off in the mid to late 2nd century and was replicated in Antioch and Alexandria. Roman authorities used other persuasive and polemical tactics, namely, as we saw, unsolicited teaching, but also financial support. They were able to not only support local widows and the needy, but they were able to support their political allies in other geographical regions, and as we see in later church history, they provided refuge for their political allies. So Rome, for Bauer, is that place where Christianity finds a way to survive and finds a way to become dominant over against mostly Eastern versions of Christianity, which in Bauer's opinion were too, as he put it, fanatical and disorganized to survive. Now, in hindsight, we can see that Bauer's book is plagued by several weaknesses, and it's important to note these so that one can be well informed. There are many weaknesses, perhaps, but 3 in particular I'll note here. The first is Bauer was widely faulted for arguments from silence. That is, he would occasionally say that because such and such a group is not mentioned, or such and such an idea is not mentioned, it must not have been dominant. In some ways, yes, this is an invalid argument, for sure, but in some ways, one has to also come to terms with the fact that many of the sources, and Bauer was working prior to the Nag Hammadi finds, many of the sources for these other types of Christianity simply were not there, and Bauer had to go fishing in the letters and treatises which survived. He knew that the material which would support his case had been suppressed, and we are all in his debt, and especially though now that the landscape has changed with the advent of Nag Hammadi and of other texts found in Egypt, we don't need to depend on any arguments from silence anymore. The other problem is an endemic problem in New Testament studies, especially at Bauer's time, is that scholars tended to move from texts to communities, and that's really not a valid move. That is to say, the existence of a text does not necessarily mean that it represents a community. So Ignatius, for instance, is not really representing a community. He's really just telling you what he as an individual thinks and hoping that his recipients will go along with it. Likewise, the Gospel of the Egyptians and the Gospel of the Hebrews, they probably don't actually represent concrete and coherent communities. They represent the viewpoints of their own individual authors. So we need to be very careful that we don't, in a sense, misrecognize the fact that texts are written by individuals and they don't necessarily represent the thought life of, or the rituals of, the larger group. And finally, as is perhaps probably most obvious, the categories, the framework of orthodoxy and heresy, which I said were really set up by Eusebius and his heirs, are outdated in modern scholarship. And Bauer knew this, but he still decided to use those categories. And what's really important to know, what everyone should know, is that we no longer need to use these categories in our courses and in our books and in our thought, because they frame the issue incorrectly. Really, there are simply many varieties of Christianity, and there in the 2nd century and well into the 3rd, they weren't thinking of themselves in terms of I'm Orthodox or I'm a heretic. And so even other categories like proto-Orthodox still don't really get us out of this old and outdated paradigm. It's best simply to use more neutral terms for the individual Christian groups and not to group them in big conglomerates, which supposedly viewed themselves as Orthodox. And I think that certainly by the 4th century there is an Orthodox group, but it's important not to be anachronistic and use, again, following Eusebius, 4th century models for understanding second and 3rd century Christian groups. We need, as best as possible, to read these texts and groups on their own terms without the later framing. In closing, let me offer some suggestions for further reading. To be honest, there is a ton of literature one could cite here, and I only am really just giving you the tip of the iceberg for those wanting more up-to-date research in early Christian diversity. And I can't recommend enough Michael Williams' Rethinking Gnosticism, which goes through very much in the thoroughness of Bauer why all the heresiological claims about these opponents, so-called Gnostics, are, in a sense, exaggerated or distorting. In the Bauerian tradition, there is Ehrman's Lost Christianities, and my own Found Christianities as a kind of response, indicating that we don't need to use the conflict model began by Bauer, but we can think more in terms of a larger ecosystem of early Christian groups in dialogue and confrontation, but also in support of each other and coexisting in relative harmony, despite the fact that, of course, later one church or one Christian community tried to claim dominance. So that's what I can recommend. I appreciate everybody for coming along and having a listen. And I hope all of you have your interest sparked, not only to read Bauer for yourself, but to plunge into the depths of early Christian studies, and as much as possible to take a fair-minded and balanced approach toward this material. Thank you again, and take care.